Bitcoin, it's everywhere you look these days, right? I
Oh.
mean, front page news, water cooler talk, you name it.
Yeah, it's certainly having a moment.
But have you ever stopped to think about its seriously wild beginnings? Because before it was mainstream, let me tell you, it was like navigating this crazy landscape, just riddled with security flaws, and let's be honest, a ton of shady stuff going on.
Oh, for sure. It's easy to forget just how risky and unpredictable those early years were for Bitcoin. Like, we're talking major growing pains.
And that's exactly where we're going with today's deep dive, right? Buckle up, because we're zooming in on this crucial period between 2010 and 2015. This is when those very first Bitcoin exchanges popped up and immediately slammed headfirst into some huge, huge challenges. We're talking security nightmares, illicit activities, the whole nine yards. We've been digging through a ton of deep research, really trying to piece together the story of these early exchanges, the hacks they faced, the scams that were swirling around, all of it.
And, understanding this period is super key if you really want to grasp the whole Bitcoin saga. These early stumbles, they really shaped how the public saw Bitcoin, and some of those perceptions, believe it or not, they still linger today.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. So our mission today is pretty straightforward. We want to unpack those big, bad, negative events that hit these early Bitcoin exchanges. What went wrong? Why did it go wrong? And how did all of this drama shape the public's perception of Bitcoin, especially back when it was just finding its feet?
It's about uncovering those crucial early chapters that often get overlooked. It's going to be a wild ride, that's for sure.
It is. Okay, so before we even get to exchanges, let's rewind a bit. How did people even get their hands on Bitcoin in those early days?
Right. Well, initially you had two main ways. First, there was mining, which, as you probably know, involves using a bunch of computing power to solve these super complicated math problems, essentially verifying transactions on the network.
Hmm.
And the second way was direct peer-to-peer trading. Basically, you'd find someone else who had Bitcoin and wanted to trade, and, well, you'd figure it out from there.
Okay, so, I mean, both of those options sound kind of limited, right? Mining, there wasn't exactly, plug and play for your average person back then. You needed some serious tech skills and some beefy hardware to even get started. And then peer-to-peer, I mean, how secure was that really? It sounds like a lot of trust involved with people you might not even know. And how could that ever scale if Bitcoin, suddenly took off?
You're absolutely spot on. That's precisely where these centralized exchanges came in. They seem like this logical answer to making Bitcoin, more user-friendly and accessible to a wider audience.
Right.
Suddenly, you have these platforms where anyone could buy, sell, and trade Bitcoin, and often they could do it using regular, traditional currencies. It was like building the on-ramp for mainstream adoption.
But here's where things get really interesting, right? Because you have Bitcoin, which is all about decentralization, taking power away from those central authorities, and then it's being traded on these centralized platforms. It almost feels like a contradiction, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's like this inherent tension, right? Bitcoin's all about distributing power, no single point of failure. But these exchanges, they kind of became these new central points holding tons of Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Suddenly, there were these juicy targets for anyone looking to, exploit the system.
Right.
And remember, this was way back when. We're talking no established security protocols like we have today, and definitely no real regulatory oversight in the crypto world. It was like the Wild West out there.
Okay, so picture this. The Wild West, but
Correct.
digital. A whole lot of experimenting, some exciting innovation, but also a ton of risk. So let's jump into some of these pioneers. Our research highlights a few key players. And first up, we've got bitcoinmarket.com, which launched way back in March of 2010. I mean, that's ancient history in crypto years.
Right. It's crazy to think about it now. Bitcoin itself was barely a year old at that point.
Wow.
And what's fascinating about bitcoinmarket.com is they used PayPal to let people trade Bitcoin for US dollars. It was a big deal at the time for establishing, a real world value for Bitcoin.
PayPal, huh? Hard to imagine that now.
Yeah.
And get this, Bitcoin was trading at less than 0.003 twents per coin. Talk about a missed opportunity. But I'm guessing that whole PayPal thing, it was a bit of a double-edged sword, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. It definitely came back to bite them. PayPal ended up suspending their relationship with bitcoinmarket.com. They were getting nervous about all the illegal activity that was, supposedly linked to Bitcoin. And, security on the platform itself wasn't exactly Fort Knox. It was pretty basic, especially by today's standards. So all of that combined eventually led to its demise.
Makes sense. Okay, so then came Mt. Gox in July 2010. Now, this name, a lot of people might recognize it, and for some pretty infamous reasons, right?
Yeah, Mt. Gox. definitely a name that's etched in Bitcoin history. But what's funny is it actually started as this online platform for trading. Wait for it. Magic, the gathering cards.
Magic. The gathering cards. Wow, that's a pretty big pivot from trading fantasy cards to becoming this global Bitcoin hub.
It is, right. But they saw the potential in Bitcoin and they jumped in head first. And they completely dominated the market for a while. I mean, at one point, they were handling over 70% of all Bitcoin transactions worldwide.
That's massive. So they were the kings, huh?
They were until they weren't.
Right, because they had those early security breaches like in June 2011, didn't they?
Yep. In 2011, they reported a theft of 2,000 Bitcoin. It caused a bit of a dip in the price, but looking back, it was a pretty clear sign of what was to come.
Wow.
Those early cracks were starting to show.
And then came the real catastrophe, the one that everyone remembers, the infamous Mt. Gox collapse of 2014. I remember hearing about it, and I wasn't even that into crypto back then. It was a big deal.
It was huge. One day, they just shut down everything, no withdrawals, website went dark, total chaos, and then came the news. They had lost, or rather, someone had stolen, around 850,000 Bitcoin. We're talking $450 million, at least at the time.
Oh.
The impact was instant. The price of Bitcoin tanked, and it really tarnished the reputation of the whole crypto space. People started asking some serious questions, right? Like, how secure are these exchanges really? Is Bitcoin even safe to hold? And to be fair, the concept of, storing most of your Bitcoin offline in cold storage, it wasn't as widespread or as sophisticated back then. A lot of exchanges were keeping huge amounts of Bitcoin in these hot wallets connected directly to the internet. Talk about a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, not the best security practices. So Mt. Gox, definitely a huge blow to Bitcoin's credibility at the time. It made people question, if this whole thing was even legitimate.
Yeah, it definitely left a mark.
Okay, so let's move on. Our research also mentions Bitstamp, launched in August 2011. They were trying to be the more, by-the-books regulated player, being based in Europe.
Right. They were all about providing this safer, more compliant environment. But here's the thing. Even being regulated didn't mean they were invincible. In 2015, they got hit with a pretty significant hack, lost around 19,000 Bitcoin.
So even with all the regulations, they still weren't immune. What happened after that?
Well, they had to shut down temporarily, investigate everything, beef up their security. They started using multi-factor authentication, which is pretty much standard now, but wasn't that common back then.
Right.
They did eventually reopen, reassured everyone that they were taking security seriously, but it was another wake-up call for the whole crypto world, like, hey, security is an ongoing battle. You can never let your guard down.
It was another reminder that this whole space was still very much the Wild West.
Absolutely.
Next up is BTCE, also launched in July 2011. And this one, it sounds like it had a very different vibe, a lot more focused on, keeping things anonymous.
Yeah, BTCE, they were popular in Russia and attracted this crowd that really valued their privacy. They were known for having, pretty lax KYC and AML procedures, know your customer, anti-money laundering, those kinds of things.
Right.
So they attracted a ton of users who wanted to stay under the radar, but, it also made them a magnet for some not so legal activities.
Because if you're not verifying who's using your platform, it's kind of asking for trouble, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a tough balance, right? Anonymity might attract users, but it also makes you a target for illicit activity and regulatory scrutiny.
Definitely a trade-off they made.
Right.
So I'm guessing the authorities eventually caught on, right?
Oh, yeah, they definitely did. Over its lifetime, BTCE processed a crazy amount of transactions, over $9 billion by some estimates, and they had over 1 million users. But in 2017, the U.S. government stepped in and shut them down. They were accused of running this huge money laundering scheme, even laundering funds from the Mt. Gox hack, the one we talked about earlier. And this case really highlighted how prioritizing anonymity above all else can backfire. It contributed to this negative image of Bitcoin, the idea that it's mainly used by criminals.
Yeah, that's a tough perception to shake. Okay, so moving on. We've got TradeHill, launched in June 2011. And their story, it's less about getting hacked and more about the struggles of trying to, operate within the regular financial system.
Yeah, TradeHill wanted to be a major player, but they had this constant battle with payment processors, especially Dwolla. They got hit with temporary suspensions, legal disputes, all sorts of financial headaches. It was like they were stuck between a rock and a hard place.
So not necessarily stolen funds in the same way as Mt. Gox, but still incredibly damaging to their business.
Exactly. And these constant roadblocks, along with the increasing scrutiny from regulators, it all just became too much. They shut down in 2013.
It's like they were caught between these two worlds, right? The new Wild West of crypto, and the old, very established world of traditional finance. And it sounds like the old world wasn't exactly welcoming.
Right.
Okay, so next on our list is local Bitcoins. They launched in 2012 and took a totally different approach, creating this peer-to-peer marketplace for buying and selling Bitcoin. So no central exchange, just individuals connecting directly.
Exactly. It was all about direct trading, often for local currencies, with a big emphasis on privacy. But that lack of a central authority and, those initially less strict KYC and AML procedures, well, it opened the door for some bad actors.
Yeah, you can see how that could be a problem.
Yeah.
Decentralized platforms, they can be great, but without the right safeguards, they can be misused.
Unfortunately, that's what happened. There were tons of cases of money laundering happening on local Bitcoins, and even some really disturbing links to serious criminal activity. And we're talking murder for hire schemes facilitated through Bitcoin on the platform. It was bad.
Wow, that's dark.
Yeah. They did eventually implement stricter verification measures, as regulations started to tighten up. But the early days of local Bitcoins, it's a cautionary tale about the potential downsides of decentralization when you don't have those strong controls in place from the very beginning. And, they actually shut down earlier this year, which maybe speaks to those early challenges.
So another example of how things can go wrong, even with good intentions. Decentralization is great, but it needs to be done responsibly.
Absolutely.
Okay, and then we have Verwex. And this one, it's got a pretty unique story, right? Because they started out dealing with Linden dollars, the currency for the virtual world Second Life. And then they added support for Bitcoin in 2011.
Yeah, Verwox, it was this weird bridge between virtual worlds and the real world, at least in terms of money. It showed how Bitcoin could connect these different online spaces. But in 2013, they got hit with a social engineering attack, not even a hack in the traditional sense.
Social engineering, so like tricking people into giving up information rather than breaking into their systems.
Exactly. They managed to compromise a BitInstant account linked to Verwox and steal a bunch of Bitcoin. And, the whole setup of Verwax, connecting Bitcoin to virtual currencies, it raised red flags for regulators. They were worried about money laundering, people moving money between these different worlds to avoid scrutiny.
So even though they weren't a traditional exchange, they still ended up in the crosshairs.
Yeah, it's like they were ahead of their time in a way, but also maybe a little too ahead of the regulations.
Right. Okay, last but not least, we have Bitfinex, which launched in 2012. And from the get-go, they were aiming for a more, professional, sophisticated trading crowd.
Yeah, they had all the bells and whistles for serious traders, and they were definitely targeting a more experienced user base. But even they weren't immune to the security issues that plagued so many exchanges back then.
So even the big boys weren't safe.
Nope. In 2015, they announced that their hot wallets had been compromised and they potentially lost over 1,400 Bitcoin. It wasn't their biggest hack. They had a much bigger one in 2016, but it was still a sign that even the exchanges that thought they were more advanced, more secure, well, they were still vulnerable.
Right. So it's pretty clear, isn't it? When you look back at all these cases, it's mind-blowing how many hacks and breaches happened between 2010 and 2015.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a couple of isolated incidents. It was like this constant threat.
Yeah, it was a wild time. And those Mt. Gox collapses, they obviously had the biggest impact. People lost fortunes, trust was shattered. It was a real mess.
Great.
But then you have Bitstamp getting hacked. Even though they were trying to be more regulated, it showed that everyone was vulnerable. I think what we're seeing is the technology was moving so fast, but security just couldn't keep up. It's a classic case of innovation outpacing security, especially in a new field like crypto.
And we can't forget about those early platforms like bitcoinmarket.com with their basic security.
Yeah.
It's almost like they didn't fully grasp the risks involved, or maybe they just weren't prepared for the scale of what they were dealing with.
Yeah, it was a learning curve for everyone. And even TradeHill, they weren't hacked in the traditional sense, but their issues with payment processors had the same devastating effect. They couldn't operate, they lost money, it was a nightmare.
So whether it was hacks, scams, or just trying to navigate the traditional financial system, those early exchanges were facing it all. It's almost surprising that anyone stuck with Bitcoin through all that chaos.
I know, right? But despite all the risk and the turmoil, there were these early adopters who really believed in Bitcoin, in the idea of a decentralized financial system. They were willing to weather the storm, to keep pushing forward.
And then, of course, you have the whole issue of Bitcoin's connection to illegal activities. It's like, on top of all the security problems, it was getting this reputation as the currency of criminals. And the Silk Road Marketplace, that's probably the most well-known example of this, right?
Oh, yeah. Silk Road was a huge deal. It operated on the dark web, totally anonymous, and it used Bitcoin exclusively for all sorts of illegal stuff. Drugs, stolen data, weapons, you name it. And it did a ton of business. We're talking millions of Bitcoin changing hands, hundreds of millions of dollars flowing through this one platform.
Wow. So the headlines were screaming Bitcoin equals crime. And I guess that had to have some impact, right? Did the Bitcoin community try to, like, distance themselves from all this?
Well, some did, for sure. There was a real effort to educate people, to explain that Bitcoin itself wasn't the problem. It was how some people were choosing to use it. But it was a tough battle.
Especially when you have the highly publicized takedown of Silk Road in 2013. I mean, it was a victory for law enforcement, but it also kind of cemented that negative image in a lot of people's minds.
Yeah, it reinforced the idea that Bitcoin was primarily a tool for criminals. It was a major setback for the community's efforts to build a more positive image. And then, of course, you have BTCE with those massive money laundering allegations. Their whole approach, the anonymity, the lax KYC and AML, it was like a giant welcome sign for people trying to clean dirty money.
And it wasn't just small-time stuff either. We're talking billions of dollars in transactions, links to cybercrime. Even a chunk of the money stolen from Mt. Gox ended up there.
Exactly. And the fact that the U.S. government shut them down and charged their operator with money laundering, it just solidified that image of Bitcoin as the currency of choice for criminals.
And local Bitcoins, with their peer-to-peer model, they played a role in this too, right?
Yeah, they were less centralized than Silk Road or BTCE, but their lack of oversight in the early days, it definitely made them a haven for money laundering and other shady activities. I mean, they even had connections to, a murder for hire scheme at one point. It was pretty wild.
It's like a reminder that with any new technology, there's always the potential for misuse, especially if the guardrails aren't there from the start.
Yeah, it's a constant balancing act, trying to foster innovation while also preventing harm.
And even Verwex, with their whole virtual currency thing, it raised concerns about money laundering, even if the scale was probably smaller compared to those dedicated exchanges.
Right. It was another example of how Bitcoin could be used to potentially move money under the radar. Regulators were definitely paying attention, trying to figure out how to wrap their heads around all of this.
So it's clear that all these negative events, the hacks, the scams, the association with illegal activity, it had a huge impact on how people viewed Bitcoin in those early years. It wasn't just seen as risky or complicated, it was seen as dangerous, something to be avoided.
Yeah, it was a real uphill battle for the community. They were trying to build this new financial system, but they kept getting hit with these setbacks, and the public perception was just tanking. It really eroded trust and confidence, and it made it that much harder to convince people that Bitcoin was something worth investing in, something worth believing in.
And all of this trauma, it must have been a huge wake-up call for regulators around the world, right? Governments don't just sit back and watch when people are losing millions of dollars and criminal activity is running rampant.
Oh, absolutely. The hacks, the thefts, the Silk Road, it all forced governments and regulators to start paying attention. They realized that this wasn't just some fringe technology anymore. It was something that needed rules, something that needed oversight. So those early negative events, they were a catalyst. They kicked off this whole global push for crypto regulations, which is still evolving today.
And what's really interesting is the Bitcoin community, they didn't just sit back and wait for governments to tell them what to do. They started coming up with their own solutions, their own best practices in response to all these challenges.
Absolutely. That's one of the things I find so inspiring about the Bitcoin community. They're resilient, they're innovative, and they're always learning. And one of the biggest things that came out of those early years was this idea of not your keys, not your coins.
Right. That's a pretty famous saying in the crypto world now, isn't it?
It is. And it became really popular after all those exchange hacks. People realized that if they didn't control their own private keys, if they relied on these centralized exchanges to hold their Bitcoin, well, they were putting themselves at risk. So the message was clear. Take control of your own assets. Don't trust third parties.
So a big shift back to the core principles of Bitcoin, that whole decentralization thing.
Exactly. And alongside that, there was this growing interest in decentralized exchanges, these platforms that would allow people to trade Bitcoin without having to rely on those centralized honeypots. You can really see the early roots of today's decentralized finance movement, the DeFi space, in those early efforts to create a more secure and resilient trading environment.
So when we look back at this whole period from 2010 to 2015, it's clear that it was a crazy time for Bitcoin, a time of huge innovation, but also huge risks and some big failures. It shaped how the world saw Bitcoin, and it laid the groundwork for the crypto ecosystem we have today.
Yeah, those were the formative years, the Wild West days. They were messy, they were chaotic, but they were also full of passion and a belief in the potential of this technology.
And the story isn't over, right? I mean, crypto's come a long way since then.
Mm.
But those early challenges, they still cast a shadow. The perception of risk, the association with illegal activity, those things haven't completely gone away.
You're right, and I think it's a question we should all be asking ourselves. Have we truly learned from those early mistakes? Have we built a system that's more secure, more transparent, more resistant to those same problems? Or are we just setting ourselves up for another round of the Wild West?
It's a question worth pondering as we continue to navigate this exciting, but sometimes treacherous world of cryptocurrencies.
Absolutely. The journey's just getting started.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.
It was a pleasure.